The detention transport's artificial gravity fluctuated as it descended through Kepler 442b's atmosphere, causing Marcus Reed to lurch against his restraints with all the dignity of a sack of wet cement. The three Zephyrian guards escorting him remained perfectly balanced, their elongated limbs moving with the fluid grace of beings evolved in lower gravity environments. "You know," Marcus said, adjusting his position as much as the energy shackles allowed, "I've been arrested on 17 different worlds, and this is definitely top 5 for atmospheric entry technique. Very smooth. Though I have to say, the in-flight entertainment could use work." The guard to his left, whose bioluminescent markings pulsed in what Marcus had learned indicated either irritation or indigestion, remained silent. The one across from him, Lyrics, according to her uniform designation, tilted her head slightly. Her ears, elegantly pointed and more expressive than most humans realized, twitched in what might have been curiosity. "You speak as though wrongful detention is a recreational activity," Lyrics observed, her voice carrying the melodic undertones common to her species. "Wrongful is such a strong word. I prefer administratively inconvenient. Has a nice bureaucratic ring to it, don't you think? Makes the whole experience sound like a paperwork error rather than a potential interstellar incident." Marcus studied the guards through the transport's transparent aluminum viewing port as the Viridian enforcement complex grew larger below them. The facility sprawled across several square kilometers of crystalline architecture that caught and refracted the planet's twin suns into spectacular light displays. "It would have been beautiful if you weren't heading there in shackles. The charges against you are quite serious," the third guard said. His name tag read Corvin, and his markings pulsed in deep reds that suggested he took his job very seriously indeed. Trafficking in restricted archaeological materials carries a minimum sentence of 15 standard years. 15 years for allegedly moving some old rocks around. That seems excessive. I once knew a guy who accidentally started a small war between mining colonies, and he only got 8 years plus community service. Granted, the community service involved defusing the situation he'd created, but still. Lyrics' markings shifted to lighter blues, patterns that Marcus recognized as indicating amusement despite her professional demeanor. "You appear remarkably calm for someone facing such consequences." "Well, panic doesn't really suit my complexion, and hysteria tends to make everything more complicated than it needs to be. Besides, I have faith in the Zephyrian legal system. Very thorough, very fair, and absolutely committed to due process. Even when that process occasionally involves arresting innocent xenoarchaeologists for doing their jobs." "Innocent?" Corvin's markings flared brighter. "You were found in possession of artifacts removed from a restricted site without proper authorization. The evidence appears quite conclusive." Marcus sighed and leaned back against the transport's cushioned seating, which had clearly been designed for Zephyrian physiology rather than human comfort. "See, this is where things get interesting. Define removed from a restricted site. Because technically, I found those artifacts floating in international space, roughly 3 astronomical units from any planetary body. If that constitutes theft, then every salvage operation in the galaxy is guilty of grand larceny. The artifacts in question originated from the Kael'tar Archaeological Preserve," Lyric said, consulting a holographic display that materialized from her wrist unit. "Carbon dating and isotopic analysis confirm their terrestrial origin. Ah, but here's the beautiful part about space archaeology: just because something originated on a planet doesn't mean it belongs to whoever currently controls that planet. Those artifacts could have been launched into space by the original inhabitants, jettisoned during an evacuation, or blown off the surface by any number of geological or astronomical events. Possession, as they say, is 9/10 of interstellar law." The transport touched down with barely perceptible contact, Zephyrian landing technology being several generations ahead of most galactic standards. Through the viewing port, Marcus could see reception committees of guards and officials arranged in the complex geometric patterns that Zephyrian culture favored for formal occasions. "You seem to know a great deal about interstellar law for an academic," Corvin observed as the transport system cycled down. You'd be surprised how much legal knowledge you accumulate when your job involves digging up other people's history and trying to determine who owns what. Plus, I spent some time doing cultural consulting work for various governments. You learn to appreciate the finer points of jurisdiction when your paycheck depends on understanding who has authority to approve research permits. Lyric stood as the transport doors hissed open, her movements displaying the kind of controlled grace that suggested military training beneath her guard uniform. Cultural consulting work. Nothing too exciting. Helping diplomatic missions understand local customs, providing historical context for treaty negotiations, that sort of thing. Amazing how often knowing that Species A considers direct eye contact an act of war can prevent awkward misunderstandings during peace talks. The guards escorted Marcus down the transport's ramp and onto the complex's main plaza. The crystalline architecture caught the afternoon light and threw it back in patterns that shifted with the viewing angle, creating an environment that was simultaneously beautiful and disorienting. Marcus had visited Zephyrian facilities before, but always as a guest rather than a detainee. "Dr. Reed," a new voice called from across the plaza. Marcus turned to see a tall Zephyrian in administrative robes approaching their group. His markings displayed the deep purples and golds that indicated high rank within the enforcement hierarchy. "I am Administrator Veltesh. We have been expecting you." "Administrator, pleasure to meet you. Though I have to say, the accommodations booking seems to have gotten mixed up somewhere. I was under the impression I'd be staying at the researchers' quarters, not the detention facility." "Easy mistake to make, they probably look very similar in the reservation system." Administrator Veltesh's markings shifted to patterns Marcus couldn't immediately interpret. "Dr. Reed, you are being held pending investigation into serious charges of artifact trafficking. This is not a misunderstanding." "Right, of course. But here's the thing about those charges, they're based on the assumption that I actually traffic something, which implies intent to sell or distribute. I was bringing those artifacts to your people for proper analysis and cataloging. If that constitutes trafficking, then every archaeological expedition in known space is guilty of smuggling. The proper channels for such discoveries involve immediate notification of planetary authorities and submission of detailed findings reports. You bypassed these protocols entirely." Marcus shrugged as much as the restraints allowed. "Administrator, with all due respect, the proper channels involve approximately 47 different forms, review committees that meet once every 6 months, and enough bureaucratic red tape to gift-wrap a small moon. By the time I navigated your proper channels, those artifacts would have been floating in space for another decade while committees argued about jurisdiction." Lyrics had been listening to this exchange with growing interest, her markings cycling through patterns that suggested deep thought. "Dr. Reed, how did you know to bring the artifacts here specifically?" "Kepler 442b has 3 different archaeological authorities." "Ah, excellent question. The isotopic signature suggested origin points consistent with the Kael'tar region, and your facility has the best xenochronology laboratory within 50 parsecs. Plus, I've worked with Dr. Thane's team before on similar projects. Professional relationships matter in this business." "You have worked with our research teams previously?" Administrator Veltesh's markings showed surprise. "Several times over the past decade. Joint human-Zephyrian expedition to the Orion Nebula archaeological sites, comparative studies of pre-contact civilizations in the Centauri sector, and that fascinating project involving the quantum resonance chambers on Arcturus IV. Dr. Thane can vouch for my credentials and professional conduct." The administrator consulted his own holographic display, cycling through what appeared to be extensive records. "These collaborations are not mentioned in our initial briefing materials. Probably got lost in interdepartmental communications. Happens all the time. I once spent 3 days trying to convince a customs official that I was the same person listed in 2 different computer systems, despite having identical biometric data and genetic profiles. Apparently, one database had my middle initial and the other didn't, which created an insurmountable bureaucratic paradox." As they moved deeper into the complex, Marcus noticed the architecture becoming more utilitarian and less artistic. The crystalline walls gave way to standard durasteel construction, and the lighting shifted from natural spectrum to the harsh illumination favored in security facilities across the galaxy. The detention processing will require standard biometric scanning and personal effects inventory, Corvin announced as they approached a checkpoint bristling with scanning equipment. Of course. Though I should mention, I'm carrying some sensitive research equipment that doesn't respond well to certain scanning frequencies. Nothing dangerous, just calibrated instruments that get cranky when exposed to standard security scanners. If something starts beeping ominously, that's probably just my quantum spectrometer having an existential crisis. Lyrics guided Marcus through the scanning process with professional efficiency, though he noticed her touch was gentler than strictly necessary when adjusting his position for the biometric readers. Her ears twitched occasionally when his jokes drew suppressed smiles from other guards, suggesting she found his humor more entertaining than her colleagues. The spectrometer readings are indeed unusual, she observed, studying the scanner output. These energy signatures. The detention transport's artificial gravity fluctuated as it descended through Kepler 442b's atmosphere, causing Marcus Reed to lurch against his restraints with all the dignity of a sack of wet cement. The three Zephyrian guards escorting him remained perfectly balanced, their elongated limbs moving with the fluid grace of beings evolved in lower gravity environments. You know, Marcus said, adjusting his position as much as the energy shackles allowed, I've been arrested on 17 different worlds, and this is definitely top 5 for atmospheric entry technique. Very smooth. Though I have to say, the in-flight entertainment could use work. The guard to his left, whose bioluminescent markings pulsed in what Marcus had learned indicated either irritation or indigestion, remained silent. The one across from him, Lyrics, according to her uniform designation, tilted her head slightly. Her ears, elegantly pointed and more expressive than most humans realized, twitched in what might have been curiosity. You speak as though wrongful detention is a recreational activity, Lyrics observed, her voice carrying the melodic undertones common to her species. Wrongful is such a strong word. I prefer administratively inconvenient. Has a nice bureaucratic ring to it, don't you think? Makes the whole experience sound like a paperwork error rather than a potential interstellar incident. Marcus studied the guards through the transport's transparent aluminum viewing port as the Viridian enforcement complex grew larger below them. The facility sprawled across several square kilometers of crystalline architecture that caught and refracted the planet's twin suns into spectacular light displays. It would have been beautiful if he weren't heading there in shackles. The charges against you are quite serious, the third guard said. His name tag read Corvin, and his markings pulsed in deep reds that suggested he took his job very seriously indeed. Trafficking in restricted archaeological materials carries a minimum sentence of 15 standard years. 15 years for allegedly moving some old rocks around. That seems excessive. I once knew a guy who accidentally started a small war between mining colonies, and he only got 8 years plus community service. Granted, the community service involved defusing the situation he'd created, but still. Lyrics' markings shifted to lighter blues, patterns that Marcus recognized as indicating amusement despite her professional demeanor. You appear remarkably calm for someone facing such consequences. Well, panic doesn't really suit my complexion, and hysteria tends to make everything more complicated than it needs to be. Besides, I have faith in the Zephyrian legal system. Very thorough, very fair, and absolutely committed to due process. Even when that process occasionally involves arresting innocent xenoarchaeologists for doing their jobs. Innocent? Corvin's markings flared brighter. You were found in possession of artifacts removed from a restricted site without proper authorization. The evidence appears quite conclusive. Marcus sighed and leaned back against the transport's cushioned seating, which had clearly been designed for Zephyrian physiology rather than human comfort. See, this is where things get interesting. Define removed from a restricted site. Because technically, I found those artifacts floating in international space, roughly 3 astronomical units from any planetary body. If that constitutes theft, then every salvage Dr. Thane's arrival transformed the detention processing from routine bureaucracy into something approaching controlled chaos. Marcus watched with professional interest as the Zephyrian archaeologist engaged Administrator Veltesh in rapid, low-toned conversation punctuated by frequent glances in his direction. "You know," Marcus said to Lyrics as they waited, "in my experience, when academics start having urgent whispered conversations about someone in custody, it usually means either the charges are about to get much more serious, or they're about to disappear entirely. There's rarely any middle ground. Which outcome would you prefer?" Lyrics asked, her ear tips twitching in what Marcus was learning to recognize as suppressed amusement. "Honestly, I'm curious enough about what Dr. Thane discovered that I'm almost willing to risk the first option to find out." Almost being the operative word, because I've seen what Zephyrian maximum security facilities look like, and they take the concept of secure containment very seriously. Corvin had positioned himself between Marcus and the ongoing discussion, though his markings indicated he was straining to overhear the conversation. "Dr. Reed, perhaps you could explain why a senior researcher would abandon his duties to discuss your case with such apparent urgency?" "Well, there are several possibilities. Maybe he's confirming my credentials and vouching for my professional conduct. Maybe he's discovered something about those artifacts that changes their legal status. Or maybe he's just really excited about the temporal displacement readings and wants to geek out about quantum archaeology with someone who appreciates the finer points of chronological paradoxes." Quantum archaeology. Lyrics' markings shifted to patterns Marcus associated with professional curiosity. "You mentioned temporal anomalies earlier. Are the artifacts you discovered exhibiting non-linear chronological signatures?" Marcus paused, considering how much technical detail to share. "Let's just say that carbon dating gave us some very interesting results. The kind of results that suggest either our understanding of decay rates is fundamentally flawed, or these objects have experienced some highly unusual interactions with spacetime." "Could you be more specific?" "Well, for starters, isotopic analysis suggests the artifacts are approximately 47,000 years old. However, quantum resonance dating indicates they were created roughly 12,000 years ago. Meanwhile, temporal field analysis suggests they've only existed for about 300 years, but in at least 4 different time streams simultaneously." Corvin's markings flared to bright orange, patterns Marcus didn't recognize but which looked distinctly alarmed. "That's impossible. Matter cannot exist in multiple temporal frameworks without causing catastrophic paradoxes." "See, that's what I thought too. Turns out the universe has a much more flexible relationship with the word impossible than most of us assume. These artifacts aren't just old, they're chronologically complex in ways that challenge some pretty fundamental assumptions about how time actually works." Dr. Thane broke away from his conversation with the administrator and approached their group, his markings cycling through rapid patterns that suggested both excitement and concern. "Dr. Reed, I need to ask you some very specific questions about the discovery circumstances." "Dr. Thane, good to see you again. Though I have to say, the circumstances could be better. How's the quantum chronology project coming along? Still making graduate students question their life choices with temporal paradox calculations?" "Marcus, this is serious. The artifacts you brought us. They're not just archaeologically significant. They're potentially dangerous." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Dangerous how?" "I mean, I've handled them extensively, and the worst injury I've sustained is a paper cut from the documentation. Though technically it was a crystalline cut, since they're made of some kind of bioceramic composite. The temporal displacement patterns match theoretical models for objects that have been subjected to artificial time manipulation. We're not talking about natural chronological anomalies, these artifacts appear to have been deliberately engineered to exist across multiple time streams." "Ah." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "That would explain the headaches I've been getting whenever I work with them for extended periods. I assumed it was just eye strain from studying intricate carvings, but temporal field exposure would cause similar symptoms." Lyrics moved closer to the conversation, her professional demeanor sharpening. "Dar. Thane, Are you suggesting these artifacts represent some form of time travel technology? Not time travel exactly, but temporal manipulation on a scale we've never encountered before. The energy signatures suggest technology capable of creating localized time distortions, possibly for communication across temporal barriers or for preserving information across vast chronological distances. Marcus whistled softly. That's brilliant. And completely terrifying. You could encode messages that exist simultaneously in past, present, and future, creating a communication system that transcends normal causality limitations. Exactly. But it also means whoever created these artifacts possessed technology far beyond current galactic capabilities. Technology that could be used for purposes far less benign than communication. Administrator Veltesh approached the group, his markings displaying the complex patterns associated with bureaucratic stress. Dar. Thane, I need clarification on the security implications of these findings. Administrator, we're dealing with artifacts that could potentially destabilize local spacetime if mishandled. Dr. Reed's decision to bring them here for analysis may have prevented a significant temporal catastrophe. Corvin looked between the two Zephyrian scientists with obvious confusion. Are you saying the charges against Dr. Reed should be dropped? I'm saying the charges are completely irrelevant compared to the larger implications, Dr. Thane replied. We need to understand how these artifacts were created, who created them, and whether there are more of them scattered throughout this sector. Marcus cleared his throat. If I might interject, there's something else you should know about the discovery site. The artifacts weren't just floating randomly in space, they were arranged in a specific geometric pattern that matches ancient Zephyrian stellar navigation charts. Pre-contact navigation charts. The silence that followed this statement stretched long enough for Marcus to wonder if he'd revealed too much too quickly. Dr. Thane's markings cycled through patterns Marcus had never seen before, while Administrator Veltesh appeared to be calculating the political ramifications of artifacts that predated official first contact protocols. How do you know about pre-contact Zephyrian navigation methods? Lyrics asked quietly. That information is restricted to military historians and senior archaeologists. Well, that's where my background in cultural consulting becomes relevant. I've done some work with various governments on historical documentation projects. Sometimes that involves researching civilizations' development patterns before official diplomatic contact. What kind of cultural consulting requires access to classified historical records? Corvin's suspicion was evident in both his tone and his markings. Marcus sighed. The kind that involves helping governments understand the historical context of civilizations they're negotiating with. Amazing how much smoother diplomatic relations go when you understand that Species A has 3,000 years of cultural trauma related to unexpected visitors, or that Species B considers gift-giving a form of military challenge. Dr. Thane moved closer to Marcus, studying him with renewed interest. Marcus, your consulting work, was it conducted under academic auspices or government contract? Both, depending on the project. Universities like the prestige of contributing to diplomatic initiatives, and governments like having academic credentials attached to their cultural research. Win-win situation, except when it results in xenoarchaeologists being arrested for doing their jobs. Which governments? Administrator Veltesh asked, his markings indicating the kind of bureaucratic alertness that suggested forms would need to be filled out. Terran Federation, obviously. Centauri Republic for the Arcturus Project. Rigelian Trade Commission for some commercial cultural assessments. A few others for smaller projects. Nothing too exotic, just standard cross-cultural consultation work. Lyrics had been studying Marcus throughout this exchange, her expression thoughtful. Dr. Reed, cultural consulting work of that scope would require security clearances from multiple governments. That level of access isn't granted to ordinary academics. You're absolutely right. It's granted to extraordinary academics with demonstrated expertise in sensitive cross-cultural situations and a proven track record of maintaining confidentiality in matters of diplomatic importance. That's a very diplomatic way of avoiding a direct answer, Corvin observed. It's also a very accurate description of my professional qualifications. Though I appreciate that from a security perspective, someone with my background discovering artifacts with potential military applications might raise some red flags. Dr. Thane consulted his portable research console, cycling through what appeared to be extensive databases. Marcus, the temporal signatures we're detecting from these artifacts, they're consistent with theoretical models for chronostabilization technology. Technology that could theoretically prevent temporal paradoxes in time-sensitive operations. Time-sensitive operations like what? Like historical research missions, diplomatic initiatives requiring knowledge of past events, or intelligence gathering across temporal barriers. Marcus felt the conversation shifting into territory that would require very careful navigation. That's fascinating theoretical work, but surely the practical applications would be limited by the enormous energy requirements for temporal manipulation. Unless the artifacts themselves serve as some form of temporal battery, storing energy across multiple time streams for later use. Administrator Veltesh's markings had shifted to deep reds that Marcus associated with significant concern. Dr. Thane, you're describing technology that could have profound implications for galactic security. I'm describing technology that apparently already exists and was discovered by a human archaeologist floating in international space. The security implications were established the moment these artifacts were created, possibly thousands of years ago. Lyrics had been following this technical discussion with obvious intelligence, her markings indicating the kind of focused attention that suggested military training beneath her guard duties. Dr. Reed, when you discovered these artifacts, did you detect any other unusual phenomena in the area? Spatial distortions, gravitational anomalies, temporal field fluctuations? Marcus considered the question carefully. There were some interesting electromagnetic readings that didn't match background stellar phenomena. Nothing dramatic, just subtle variations that suggested the presence of technology rather than natural stellar activity. How subtle? Subtle enough that you'd need specialized equipment to detect them, obvious enough that anyone looking for signs of artificial technology would notice them immediately. That suggests the artifacts were meant to be found by someone with appropriate technical knowledge, Dr. Thane said. Someone who would recognize their significance and bring them to proper analytical facilities. Or, Marcus said slowly, someone who would trigger whatever automated systems might still be monitoring the area for signs of discovery. The implication of this statement settled over the group like a heavy blanket. If Marcus was right, then his discovery and removal of the artifacts might have activated ancient monitoring systems that could be reporting his actions to unknown parties with unknown intentions. Dr. Reed, Administrator Veltesh said formally, I believe we need to discuss the possibility of upgrading your accommodations from detention to protective custody. Protective custody? Marcus raised an eyebrow. That sounds ominous. Are we talking about protection from legal consequences, or protection from whoever might have created chronologically impossible artifacts and left them floating in space for archaeologists to find? Possibly both. Marcus looked around at the group of Zephyrian officials, noting the increasing complexity of their markings and the growing tension in their body language. You know, when I woke up this morning, I thought the most complicated part of my day would be filling out the paperwork for artifact analysis requests. I should have known better. Why? Lyrics asked. Because in my experience, any day that starts with, this should be simple, inevitably ends with, how did everything get so complicated? It's like a universal law of archaeology, the more routine you expect a discovery to be, the more likely it is to rewrite everything you thought you knew about the universe. Dr. Thane's console chimed with an incoming priority message. As he read the display, his markings shifted to patterns that Marcus found distinctly alarming. What is it? Administrator Veltesh asked. Long-range sensors have detected 3 unidentified vessels entering the outer system. They're broadcasting no identification and responding to no communication attempts. Marcus felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the kind that came from years of being in situations where simple academic research became suddenly much more complicated. Dr. Thane, what are the odds that those ships are just coincidental traffic? Given current circumstances? Approximately 0. Right. So we're probably looking at interested parties who want to discuss my recent archaeological discoveries in person. That would be my assessment, Administrator Veltesh said grimly. Marcus sighed and looked at Lyrics, whose markings were cycling through patterns he couldn't interpret but which looked distinctly like someone preparing for combat operations. Well, this escalated quickly. The Viridian Enforcement Complex's alarm systems began their measured, harmonious warning cycles, a distinctly Zephyrian approach to crisis management that somehow made impending danger sound like a musical performance. Marcus found himself appreciating the aesthetic even as he contemplated the various ways his day could get worse. 3 unidentified vessels, he mused, watching the facility's personnel shift into emergency protocols with impressive efficiency. That's either a very small invasion force or a very large archaeological expedition. I'm hoping for the latter, but preparing for the former. Commander Thale strode into the detention area with the kind of purposeful urgency that suggested military background and current authority over things that could explode. His markings displayed the deep golds and silvers that Marcus recognized as senior command insignia, while his bearing radiated the confidence of someone accustomed to making decisions under pressure. Dar. Reed, Commander Thale said without preamble, we need to discuss your previous government consulting work in detail. Specifically, any projects involving temporal research or chronological security protocols. Marcus glanced at Lyrics, whose markings had shifted to patterns suggesting heightened alertness and possibly concern for his well-being. Commander, with respect, that's a conversation that typically requires security clearances and non-disclosure agreements. I'm not sure a detention facility is the appropriate venue. Dr. Reed, 3 unknown vessels just entered our system approximately 40 minutes after your arrival with artifacts exhibiting impossible temporal characteristics. Either this is an extraordinary coincidence, or your presence here has triggered some form of automated response. Automated response to what? Dr. Thane consulted his research console, which was now displaying real-time sensor data from the complex's monitoring systems. The artifacts you discovered, we've been analyzing their communication protocols. They're not just chronologically displaced objects. They're active transmission devices. Marcus felt the familiar sensation of simple situations becoming exponentially more complex. Transmission devices sending what kind of information? Location data, temporal coordinates, and what appears to be a detailed scan of whoever handled them most recently. Including full biometric profiles and genetic analysis. Ah. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. So when I picked them up, they essentially called home and provided a complete description of who found them and where they could be located. That appears to be the case. Commander Thale moved closer to Marcus, his markings displaying patterns that suggested both suspicion and growing respect. Dr. Reed, artifacts with those capabilities don't get created by accident. Someone designed them to be discovered by specific individuals with specific qualifications. The question being whether I qualify as the right kind of person or the wrong kind of person from the perspective of whoever's coming to collect their property. Lyrics had positioned herself between Marcus and the entrance, her hand resting near her sidearm in a gesture that appeared casual but suggested professional training in personal protection. Dr. Reed, your government consulting work, did it ever involve projects related to pre-contact civilizations or archaeological security protocols? Marcus considered his answer carefully. Some of my consulting work involved helping governments understand the implications of discovering evidence of previously unknown civilizations. The kind of work that becomes important when you find artifacts suggesting that galactic history is more complicated than previously assumed. More complicated how? Commander Thale asked. Well, for example, artifacts that suggest certain civilizations achieved advanced technology thousands of years before official first contact protocols would indicate. Or evidence that some species were engaging in interstellar communication long before they were supposed to have developed spaceflight capabilities. Dr. Thane looked up from his console with obvious excitement. Marcus, are you saying these artifacts represent evidence of a previously unknown pre-contact civilization? I'm saying these artifacts represent evidence of something that challenges our current understanding of when various technologies were developed and by whom. Whether that constitutes a previously unknown civilization or just really good archaeological preservation techniques is still an open question. The facility's communication systems crackled to life with an incoming transmission from the approaching vessels. The voice that emerged spoke accented but fluent Galactic standard, with undertones that suggested non-human vocal anatomy. Kepler 442b Enforcement Facility, this is Recovery Team 7. We are responding to artifact retrieval protocols. Please prepare Dr. Marcus Reed for immediate transfer to our custody. Commander Thale's markings flared to bright reds and golds. Recovery Team 7, this is Commander Thale of the Viridian Enforcement Complex. Dr. Reed is currently in protective custody pending investigation of potential security threats. We cannot authorize transfer without proper diplomatic protocols. Commander Thale, Dr. Reed is in possession of classified materials that fall under ancient treaty obligations. His transfer is not subject to current diplomatic protocols. Marcus whistled softly. Ancient treaty obligations. That's a new one. Usually people just claim diplomatic immunity or sovereign rights. Ancient treaty obligation suggests someone's been doing their legal homework for a very long time. Lyrics as markings cycled through patterns Marcus was learning to associate with rapid tactical thinking. Dr. Reed, do you have any knowledge of ancient treaties that might apply to archaeological discoveries? Well, there are some very old agreements between various species regarding the handling of artifacts from extinct civilizations. Most of them are considered obsolete because they predate modern galactic governance structures. But technically, they were never formally revoked. What kind of agreements? Commander Thale demanded. Mostly protocols for protecting archaeological sites and ensuring that discoveries related to certain categories of technology are handled by appropriate authorities rather than national governments. The theory being that some knowledge transcends current political boundaries. Dr. Thane's console chimed with new data from the long-range sensors. Commander, the approaching vessels are exhibiting technology signatures consistent with the temporal artifacts. Whatever civilization created those objects appears to still exist. The implications of this statement hit the group simultaneously. Marcus could see the realization dawning on their faces as they processed the fact that they weren't dealing with ancient history but with current political reality. So, Marcus said slowly, the artifacts weren't just archaeological discoveries. They were modern technology from a civilization that's apparently been operating outside normal galactic political structures for quite some time. That appears to be the case, Commander Thale said grimly. And now representatives of that civilization are here to collect their property and possibly discuss my unauthorized handling of their technology. Also accurate. Marcus looked around at the assembled Zephyrian officials, noting the increasing tension in their markings and body language. Right. So the question becomes whether I'm about to be arrested by people who consider me a thief, recruited by people who consider me qualified for something, or eliminated by people who consider me a security risk. The communication system crackled again. Commander Thale, we are prepared to discuss the terms of Dr. Reed's transfer. However, we require immediate confirmation of his identity and current status. What kind of confirmation? Commander Thale asked. Physical verification of genetic markers and examination of any modifications or identifying marks he may carry. Lyrics moved even closer to Marcus, her protective positioning becoming more obvious. Genetic markers and identifying marks. Marcus felt a familiar chill run down his spine. That's oddly specific. Most people ask for fingerprints or retinal scans. Genetic markers suggests they're looking for something more fundamental than standard identification. Dar. Reed, Commander Thale said formally, I need to ask whether you carry any unusual identifying marks or modifications that might be relevant to this situation. Marcus paused, considering the implications of full disclosure versus continued evasion. The approaching ships and their specific requests suggested that whoever was coming already knew more about him than he'd revealed to his current captors. Commander, that's a complicated question with potentially complicated answers. The short version is yes, I carry identifying marks related to my previous government work. The longer version involves security classifications and agreements that predate my current circumstances. What kind of identifying marks? The kind that identify someone as having specific qualifications and authorization to handle certain categories of sensitive materials. The kind that might explain why artifacts with built-in security protocols would be safe to handle for someone with appropriate credentials. Dr. Thane looked up from his console with obvious realization. Marcus, you're not just a consultant who happened to discover these artifacts. You're someone who was specifically qualified to discover them safely. That's a reasonable interpretation of recent events. Commander Thale's markings shifted to patterns Marcus associated with someone making difficult decisions under pressure. Dr. Reed, I need to know exactly what we're dealing with here. Are you a civilian academic who stumbled into a complicated situation, or are you someone whose presence here was anticipated by parties we don't understand? Marcus considered his options carefully. His cover as a simple archaeological consultant was becoming increasingly untenable, but full disclosure would raise even more questions about his actual background and current mission parameters. Commander, I'm someone whose qualifications and background made it possible for me to safely discover and handle artifacts that would have been dangerous for most people to encounter. Whether that discovery was coincidental or anticipated is a question I can't answer without knowing more about who created the artifacts and why they were left where I found them. The facility's proximity alarms began sounding as the approaching vessels entered the planet's immediate orbital space. Through the complex's transparent sections, Marcus could see unfamiliar ship configurations descending through the atmosphere with the kind of controlled precision that suggested advanced technology and experienced pilots. They're landing without authorization, Corvin observed, monitoring the complex's security systems. They're landing according to ancient treaty protocols that supersede current authorization requirements, Commander Thale corrected grimly. Which means we're about to have visitors with legal authority that predates our current government structures. Marcus watched the ship settle onto the complex's main landing areas with barely perceptible contact. The vessels themselves were unlike anything in his extensive database of galactic spacecraft, organic curves combined with crystalline structures that seemed to shift and flow even when stationary. Beautiful ships, he observed. Definitely the same technological aesthetic as the artifacts. Whoever built those has a very distinctive approach to engineering that prioritizes elegance and efficiency in equal measure. Lyrics had drawn her sidearm, though she kept it lowered in a ready position rather than an aggressive stance. Dr. Reed, do you have any recommendations for how we should handle this situation? Marcus considered the question seriously. Well, standard diplomatic protocol suggests we should be polite, professional, and prepared for anything. Beyond that, I'd recommend being very careful about what questions we ask until we understand exactly who we're dealing with and what they want. And what do you think they want? Based on their technology, their approach, and their specific interest in my identifying marks. I think they want to determine whether I'm someone they've been looking for or someone who accidentally stumbled into something much larger than a routine archaeological discovery. The complex's main entrance cycled open to admit a delegation of beings whose appearance immediately explained the technological sophistication of their vessels. They moved with fluid grace, wore clothing that seemed to incorporate living materials, and carried themselves with the confidence of people accustomed to being the most advanced civilization in any given situation. Dr. Marcus Reed, the lead figure, called out, their voice carrying harmonics that suggested sophisticated vocal modifications. We have come to discuss your recent discovery and its implications for continued galactic stability. Marcus looked at Lyrics, whose markings were cycling through patterns that suggested both fascination and concern. Well, he said quietly, I think we're about to find out exactly how complicated my day can get. The delegation from the mysterious vessels moved through the Viridian Enforcement Complex with the kind of confident familiarity that suggested they'd been in similar facilities before. Their leader, a tall figure whose features combined elements Marcus couldn't immediately categorize, approached the group with diplomatic bearing that somehow managed to be both respectful and subtly intimidating. Commander Thale, the leader said, offering what appeared to be a formal greeting gesture. I am Archon Kethvar of the Temporal Covenant. We appreciate your cooperation in this matter. Temporal Covenant. Commander Thale's markings displayed patterns Marcus associated with someone trying to access historical databases in real time. I'm not familiar with that organization. Few are, by design. We operate under authority granted by treaties signed before most current governments existed. Our mandate involves protecting temporal integrity and managing archaeological discoveries that could destabilize galactic chronology. Marcus felt pieces of a very large puzzle beginning to snap into place. Let me guess, you're the people who created the artifacts I found, and you've been waiting for someone with appropriate qualifications to discover them and bring them to a proper analytical facility. Archon Kethvar turned their attention to Marcus with what might have been approval. Dr. Reed, you adapt to complex situations with impressive speed. Yes, the artifacts were placed as part of a monitoring system designed to detect individuals with specific genetic and educational qualifications. Genetic qualifications? Lyrics asked, her markings showing the kind of sharp attention Marcus associated with someone identifying potential threats. Dr. Reed carries markers that identify him as a descendant of the original Covenant signatories. His genetic heritage, combined with his professional qualifications and security clearances, makes him eligible for knowledge that has been preserved across millennia. Marcus felt the familiar sensation of his carefully constructed cover identity crumbling under the weight of information he'd hoped never to reveal. Archon, that's information I wasn't expecting to discuss in a detention facility on a mining planet. Circumstances have evolved beyond standard protocols, Dr. Reed. The temporal stability of this sector requires immediate action. Dr. Thane consulted his research console with obvious excitement. Archon Kethvar, are you saying that Dr. Reed's discovery was part of a pre-planned sequence of events designed to activate some form of temporal protection protocol? The artifacts serve multiple functions, Dr. Thane. They monitor temporal fluctuations, identify qualified individuals, and provide early warning of chronological threats. Dr. Reed's discovery indicates that such threats are now active in this sector. Commander Thale moved closer to the conversation, his markings displaying the complex patterns associated with someone balancing multiple competing concerns. What kind of chronological threats? Unauthorized temporal manipulation, attempts to alter established historical events, and the development of technology that could create paradoxes affecting multiple timelines simultaneously. Marcus felt a growing sense of inevitability about where this conversation was heading. Let me guess, you need someone with my particular combination of qualifications to help identify and neutralize these threats. Your assessment is correct, Dr. Reed. However, the decision to accept such responsibilities remains yours to make. Lyrics had been following this exchange with obvious intelligence, her markings cycling through patterns that suggested rapid analysis of implications and possibilities. Dr. Reed, are you saying you have a choice in this matter? Apparently so. Though I suspect it's the kind of choice where saying no means spending the rest of my life wondering what would have happened if I'd said yes, while saying yes means embarking on something that will probably be simultaneously fascinating and terrifying. Archon Kethvar produced a device that appeared to be grown rather than manufactured, its organic curves pulsing with internal light. Dr. Reed, before you make your decision, you should understand the full scope of what we're asking. I'm listening. The temporal threats we've detected suggest that someone is attempting to weaponize chronological manipulation technology. If successful, they could alter past events to change current political situations, create paradoxes that destabilize entire star systems, or establish temporal dominance over civilizations that haven't yet developed appropriate defensive measures. Dr. Thane looked up from his console with obvious alarm. That would be catastrophic. The energy requirements alone would create gravitational anomalies that could affect entire sectors. Precisely. Which is why the Temporal Covenant exists, to prevent such scenarios from occurring. Marcus studied the Archon's device, noting its resemblance to the artifacts he'd discovered. And you need someone with my background because... Because stopping temporal weapons requires understanding both the technology involved and the historical context that makes such weapons appealing to their creators. You possess expertise in xenoarchaeology, experience with government consulting, and genetic heritage that grants access to Covenant knowledge bases. Plus, Marcus said wryly, I apparently have a talent for stumbling into complicated situations and somehow managing not to make them worse. That talent has been noted in your file. Lyric stepped closer to Marcus, her expression serious. Dar. Reed, if you accept this responsibility, what happens to your current situation here? Archon Kethvar addressed this question directly. Commander Thale, Dr. Reed's previous legal status becomes irrelevant under Covenant authority. However, his mission will require support from local authorities familiar with this sector's political and technological landscape. What kind of support? Commander Thale asked. Liaison services, technical consultation, and potentially armed escort for operations in hostile territory. Marcus looked at Lyrics, noting the way her markings had shifted to patterns suggesting both concern and determination. Lyrics, you're not seriously considering volunteering for something this dangerous, are you? Dr. Reed, I've spent my career in enforcement work dealing with routine security threats and standard criminal activity. The opportunity to work on something that could affect galactic stability is compelling. It's also likely to be incredibly dangerous and probably fatal if we make mistakes. That describes most worthwhile endeavors. Archon Kethvar observed this exchange with what might have been approval. Guard Lyrics, your service record indicates qualifications that would be valuable for Covenant operations. However, such work requires abandoning your current position and accepting authority that operates outside normal governmental structures. I understand the implications. Marcus felt the weight of decision settling around him like a familiar coat. He'd spent years avoiding the kind of large-scale responsibilities that could reshape his life, preferring the controlled complexity of archaeological research to the unpredictable chaos of galactic politics. But the convergence of his discovery, his background, and the current crisis suggested that choice was becoming illusion. Archon, Marcus said finally, before I agree to anything, I need to know one thing. Are we talking about preventing someone from acquiring temporal weapons, or stopping someone who already has them? The pause before Kethvar answered told Marcus everything he needed to know. The weapons already exist, Dr. Reed. Our mission is to prevent their deployment. Right. Of course they do. Marcus looked around at the assembled group, Zephyrian officials trying to process information that challenged their understanding of galactic politics, a Covenant representative offering him responsibilities that could reshape his life, and Lyrics preparing to abandon her career for the opportunity to work on something unprecedented. Dr. Reed, Dr. Thane said quietly, if these temporal weapons are deployed, the archaeological record we've spent our careers studying could be altered retroactively. Everything we think we know about galactic history could become false. That's a sobering thought. It's also motivation for ensuring such weapons never get used. Marcus moved to where his restraints had been abandoned when the situation shifted from detention to diplomatic crisis. The energy shackles lay powerless on the floor, symbols of how quickly circumstances could transform the impossible into the inevitable. Archon Kethvar, Marcus said, beginning to remove his jacket, you mentioned needing to verify identifying marks and genetic markers. That verification will confirm your eligibility for Covenant knowledge and operational authority. As Marcus loosened his collar, exposing the intricate tattoo that wound around his neck in patterns that seemed to shift and flow in the complex's lighting, the reactions from the assembled group were immediate and dramatic. Lyrics' markings flared to brilliant whites and golds, patterns Marcus had never seen but which clearly indicated profound recognition. Dar. Thane's equipment registered energy readings that shouldn't have been possible from a simple tattoo, while Commander Thale's markings cycled through configurations that suggested someone accessing ancient historical databases. The mark of the Eternal Covenant, Lyrics whispered, her voice carrying tones of reverence and awe. I thought it was a legend. Many things that are considered legends have a tendency to turn out to be historical fact, Marcus replied. Usually at the most inconvenient possible moments. Archon Kethvar approached Marcus, producing a scanning device that resonated with the tattoo's patterns. The mark confirms your heritage and grants you access to Covenant archives, technological resources, and operational authority. It also places you under ancient laws that supersede current galactic governmental structures, including immunity from arrest for alleged artifact trafficking, among other protections. Commander Thale's markings had settled into patterns Marcus associated with someone reaching important decisions. Dr. Reed, if you accept Covenant authority, what are your intentions regarding the current situation? Marcus considered the question carefully. My intentions are to prevent temporal weapons from being used to destabilize galactic civilization while trying not to get anyone killed in the process. Beyond that, I'm making this up as I go along. That's remarkably honest for someone who apparently has ancient legal authority that supersedes most government structures. Honesty tends to be more efficient than elaborate deception, especially when you're dealing with people intelligent enough to see through most lies anyway. Lyrics moved to stand beside Marcus, her decision evident in her bearing before she spoke. Archon Kethvar, I formally request assignment to Dr. Reed's mission as liaison and security support. Request granted, Guard Lyrics. Though I should mention that Covenant operations often involve circumstances that challenge conventional understanding of how the universe works. I'm prepared for that possibility. Marcus looked at Lyrics, noting the way her expression combined determination with barely contained excitement. Are you sure about this? Because once we start down this path, there's probably no going back to routine enforcement work. Dr. Reed, do you remember what you said earlier about perspective being everything? I remember several things I said about perspective. Which specific observation are you referring to? That you're either a dangerous criminal or an innocent researcher about to solve a mystery that could rewrite our understanding of civilization. You were right about perspective being everything, but you missed a third option. Which is? Lyrics' smile carried the weight of someone who had glimpsed possibilities beyond her previous imagination. That you're someone whose life was always leading toward this moment, and everything that came before was just preparation for something much larger than either of us initially realized. Marcus felt the truth of this statement settling into place with the kind of certainty that came from recognizing patterns that had been building for years without his conscious awareness. His archaeological career, his government consulting work, his security clearances, and even his arrest had all been steps leading toward this convergence of ancient responsibilities and current crisis. Well, Marcus said, extending his hand to Lyrics in a gesture that felt simultaneously like greeting and farewell, if we're going to save galactic civilization from temporal weapons, we might as well do it together. As Lyrics took his hand, her markings flared in patterns that seemed to echo the flowing designs of his tattoo. Marcus realized that his simple archaeological discovery had become something far more significant, the beginning of a partnership that would either prevent catastrophic temporal warfare or die trying to prevent it. Either way, it was going to be interesting.